The lane is sunk between two hedge banks, and the gunner has his range set at 300 meters. The first shell strikes the lead tank, where the hull meets the turret, and it stops dead. The second one burns, and the smoke comes down the lane thick and oily. Through it, he can hear engines that have not stopped moving. At first light, he counted 9 American tanks in the field beyond the hedge. He has killed 3 of them today. Before the light goes, he counts 14. That is the thing he cannot account for. And it is not the armor, and it is not the gun. German crews met the M4 Sherman with a confidence that was, on paper, entirely justified. Their guns went through it. Their own tanks were better protected and better armed. They lost anyway, steadily, across 2 years and 3 continents. What unsettled them was never really the tank in front of them. It was everything standing behind it. This episode is about 7 things the men of the Wehrmacht could not account for in a machine they thought they understood. By the summer of 1944, the German army had been fighting tank battles for almost 5 years. It had learnt its trade against the French, the British, and above all the Soviets. It knew what a good tank was, and it had built several. The Tiger I carried 100 mm of armor across its front plate, and an 88 mm gun. The Sherman carried a little over 50 mm and a 75. By every measure a German crew trusted, this was not a fair fight. There is an irony in this that the German army never quite escaped. It had taught the world that armor was a weapon of movement, of speed, of arriving where nobody expected you. By 1944 it was the side sitting still. Its best tanks travelled to the front by rail, because they could not be trusted to drive there. Its fuel arrived in trickles. Its workshops were bombed at night. The army that invented lightning war had become the army that could not move. What follows is what its crews saw coming towards them, and could not make sense of. Start with something a man could pick up. A single link of track, dropped in the mud beside a workshop lorry. It is steel, and it is heavy enough that 2 men lift it awkwardly between them. But the face of it, the part that meets the road, is molded rubber. Inside the pin housings there is more rubber, bonded to the metal. German crews who found these turned them over in their hands. Their own track was steel throughout, dry pinned, and it wore itself out. A long road march punished a German tank before it ever met the enemy. Pins walked out of their housings and were hammered back by exhausted men in the cold. The American track ran quietly, and it ran a very long way. Rubber block track was rated in the region of 2,500 miles. Rubber tires on the road wheels stopped the machine from shaking itself apart. Germany could not copy this, and the reason was not engineering, it was geography. Natural rubber came from Southeast Asia, and from 1942 onwards Germany had almost none. Late Panthers and the Tiger II rolled on steel-tired road wheels because there was nothing else to put on them. In 1941, American plants made a few thousand tons of synthetic rubber. 4 years later they were making more than 800,000. In post-war interrogation reports, German officers came back repeatedly to how seldom American tanks seemed to be stranded. It was a small thing, a pad of rubber on a steel shoe. It was also the first sign that this tank had been designed by people who expected it to travel. The question was how far. 200 Panthers went forward at Kursk in July 1943. Within a week, fewer than 50 were still running. Most of the missing had not been hit by anything at all. They had simply broken. This was the second thing, and it was harder to see than a track link. German crews accepted breakdown as the price of a powerful machine. The Panther weighed 45 tons, and the Tiger I nearly 57, and the running gear underneath them suffered for it. Final drives failed. Transmissions failed. Serious repair often meant lifting the turret off, which meant a crane, which meant a workshop far behind the line. The Americans did the opposite thing. The Sherman carried its transmission in a bolted housing at the front, and the whole assembly could come off as a unit. An engine could be changed by a maintenance section working in a field. Men did it in a day, in the open, with the smell of hot oil hanging in the hedge. So the American tanks arrived. In August 1944, American armoured columns ran across France in weeks, covering hundreds of miles under their own power. German formations moving to meet them were bombed on the railways they depended on. Paraphrased from testimony collected after the war, German maintenance officers described the American system with something close to envy. Repair happened forward, near the fighting, by the men who owned the tank. A tank that cannot reach the battle is not a tank. It is a monument. But the two sides did meet, constantly, and when they did, the first seconds decided everything. A crossroads in the bocage, hedges on all four corners, dust hanging in the heat. A German commander sees the American tank before the American tank sees him. He has the advantage, and perhaps 4 seconds in which to use it. He loses. The third of these made no sense to men who had been told the Sherman was crude. A Sherman turret could turn a full circle in about 15 seconds, driven by a hydraulic motor that whined as it worked. Inside the turret it smells of hydraulic fluid and cordite, and the gunner's hand never leaves the control. A Tiger I turned its turret off the engine, and at idle a full circle took close to a minute. There was more. The Sherman's gun was stabilized in elevation. A trained gunner could hold the sight near the target whilst the tank was moving. Most crews never learnt to use it. Some did, and those crews fired first. In close country this decided everything. In the hedgerows of Normandy, engagements opened at a few hundred meters, and often much less. Neither tank's armour mattered greatly at that range, because both guns worked at that range. What mattered was whose turret came round first, and whose loader had a round ready. German gunners described being beaten to the shot by tanks they had been taught to despise, in accounts historians treat as representative rather than verified quotation. That was the humiliation of it. The Sherman was not supposed to win the duel, and often it did. And when it lost, it did something else the Germans had not expected. Everyone knew the Sherman burned. German gunners knew it. Allied crews knew it. The nickname followed the tank for 80 years. It was true, and then it was not, and the reason was not petrol. The fourth thing the Germans could not account for was why the burning stopped. Early Shermans stored their 75mm ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides, above the tracks. A penetration there set off the propellant, and the tank went up in seconds, with a sound crews never forgot. American ordnance studied the wrecks, and found that roughly 7 in 10 penetrated Shermans burned. The fix was water. From 1944, ammunition moved to the hull floor, into racks jacketed with a water and glycol mixture. The burn rate fell to roughly 1 in 10. At the same time a hatch was cut for the loader, so that all 5 men had a way out. There was already an escape hatch in the floor, behind the assistant driver. British operational research in Normandy found that when a Sherman was knocked out, roughly 1 of its 5 men was killed. 4 walked away, often burned, often deaf, and usually back in a tank within days. German crews had been trained to think that killing the tank killed the crew. In their own experience it very often did. What they saw instead were men rolling off the hull into the corn and running. In post-war debriefings, German veterans described the sight as demoralizing in a way the tank itself never was. Because a crew that lives is a crew that comes back. And so, it turned out, were the tanks. In August 1944, in the pocket at Falaise, the German army left several hundred armoured vehicles behind. Many of them were not destroyed. They were out of fuel, or had thrown a track, or had a fault a workshop could have cured in an afternoon. It made no difference. The ground belonged to somebody else now. Work backwards from that, and you reach the fifth thing. A knocked-out tank is only a lost tank if you cannot get to it. The Americans built a vehicle whose entire purpose was getting to it. The M32 recovery vehicle was a Sherman with the turret removed and a winch inside. It dragged wrecks out of ditches with cable that groaned under load and flung wet mud as it took the strain. Behind that sat heavy ordnance companies, depots, and a rebuild program. Hulls came back scorched and went out again repainted. Damage that would have written off a German tank became a fortnight of work. The Germans understood this perfectly and could not do it. Recovery needs the battlefield, and after that summer they were nearly always retreating. It needs fuel, and by the autumn fuel was the thing they did not have. It needs workshops that are not on fire. Recorded in post-war debriefings, German officers spoke of abandoning vehicles that were mechanically sound, and of the particular bitterness of it. A machine that had taken 1,000 hours to build was left in a field because there was no tow. Even so, the tanks were not what frightened them most. German prisoners were asked what they feared, and their answers were unusually consistent. It was not the Sherman. It was not the fighter bombers, though those were bad enough. It was the artillery, and specifically the speed of it. What came sixth was not really about tanks at all. It was about what the tanks could summon. American gunnery ran through a fire direction center, where men with charts and telephones computed firing data for many batteries at once. A single observer, sometimes sitting in a tank turret, could call for the fire of every battalion in range. The rounds were timed to land together. At Mortain in August 1944, the Germans attacked westwards with several Panzer divisions to cut the American breakout. Artillery, observation and air power stopped it within days. Men who lived through those barrages described the ground moving underneath them and the noise arriving with no warning at all. German artillery was skilled, and its guns were good. What it could not do was concentrate quickly. It lacked the communications, the ammunition, and the fuel to shift guns forward. So the Sherman was never really fighting alone, and this is what its opponents kept missing. It was the visible part of a system whose real weapon was the telephone and the radio net. The tank was an argument that arrived with everything else already behind it. In post-war interrogation reports, German commanders returned to American artillery more often than to any American weapon. They had expected amateurs. They met a machine for organizing violence. And behind that machine was the number that never went down. Germany built 1,347 Tiger Is. It built roughly 6,000 Panthers. The United States built just over 49,000 Shermans. Then it carried them across 3,000 miles of ocean and still had them outnumber German armor at the far end. The last of the 7 is the one that decided the argument. Losses could be replaced faster than they could be inflicted. An American tank battalion that lost tanks in the morning could draw replacements from a depot within days. The crews were often the same men, patched up and sent forward again. New tanks came ashore in factory paint, thick with preservative grease that had to be scrubbed off before use. The German system could not answer at any point in the chain. Factories were bombed. Skilled labor was conscripted or dead. The Panther and the Tiger were slow to build, and each one lost was a hole that stayed open. A German crew whose tank burned might wait weeks for another, or fight the rest of the war on foot. There is a comfortable version of this that German officers told afterwards, and it needs handling carefully. In post-war interrogation reports, many explained their defeat as a matter of material alone. Historians have pointed out that this was also a convenient explanation for men who had lost. It was, all the same, largely true. You could see it in the fields. Burnt-out German vehicles sat where they had died, week after week, rusting into the hedges. American wrecks went away on transporters, and something came back. That is what a gunner in a sunken lane was actually looking at, though he had no way of knowing it. 9 at dawn, 3 killed, 14 by evening. The arithmetic was not a mistake, and it was not reinforcement in the way he understood the word. Some of those tanks had come up from a beach dump 40 miles away. Some had been repaired in a field the day before. At least one of them, on a given week in Normandy, was a tank that had been knocked out once already, dragged back, made whole, and handed to a crew that had survived losing it. That is the difference between the two nations, and it is not a difference in courage or skill. Germany built objects. The United States built a process. One nation asked what the best tank was. The other asked what could be produced, shipped, driven, repaired, crewed by ordinary men, and replaced by Friday. The second question is the one that wins wars, and it is the duller question, which is why it is so often overlooked. The German crews were not wrong about the Sherman. It was, tank for tank, the lesser machine, and men died in it because of that. They were wrong about what they were fighting. They kept looking at the vehicle, and the answer was never in the vehicle. He would never see the depots, or the ships, or the room where men with telephones did arithmetic for 100 guns. He saw tanks in a field and counted them, which is all any soldier can do. The count was the only part of the system visible from a hedgerow. In the lane, the smoke thins and the light starts to go. Somewhere behind the American line, in the dark, a recovery crew is hooking a cable to something he was sure he had finished. The count goes up.